Hello and welcome back to Book Lust. I'm your host, Nancy Pearl. My guest today, via Zoom, at the Folio Library in downtown Seattle, is author and playwright Cristina García. Cristina, thank you so much for joining us today on Book Lust. It's just such a pleasure to get to talk to you about your writing and especially your new book.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to be back.
So let's start back in the 90s. You wrote a book called Dreaming in Cuban, right? Exactly.
That was many years ago. All right.
And so you wrote a novel called Dreaming in Cuban, and it was about the Cuban Revolution, the immigrant experience, the world that was at that time. And then, many years later, but I know they went by very quickly because that's what time does, you wrote a sequel to Dreaming in Cuban called Vanishing Maps. So can we go back and start with the impetus for Dreaming in Cuban and introduce some of the characters who are going to reappear in one form or another in Vanishing Maps?
Right. Well, sure. Of course. Thank you. Well, Dreaming in Cuban was my very first novel. It came out in 1992, and I would say it's the most autobiographical of anything written, not surprisingly, since it was the first novel. And it chronicles the lives of a family bitterly divided over the Cuban Revolution. Half of them stay in Cuba, the other half emigrate to the U.S. And what ensues is this shouting match for decades thereafter. And it focuses on the women of this family. The matriarch, Celia del Pino, who's a devotee, staunch supporter of the revolution. Her daughter, Felicia, who's a kind of deranged hairdresser. And then the other daughter, Celia's other daughter, who leaves, ends up in New York, opening a bakery and vowing to fight communism from behind her counter with her crawlers and sticky puns. She has a daughter, Pilar, who is the opposite of her mother, as often happens. And there is a reunion involved where the mother-daughter go back to Cuba and all kinds of mischief and mayhem ensue. So I think that's a kind of overview.
Yeah. What I thought, I mean, these lovely touches that you had in Dreaming in Cuban. So the name of the bakery that Pilar's mother starts, begins, which is a series of bakeries in New York, they're called Yankee Doodle. I mean, she's fighting communism in every possible way that she can. There was, as in many Latin American novels, there was what we call magic realism, but what I always prefer to think of it as elastic realism, that to say it's magic realism in a way narrows it, but elastic realism, you sort of think of a rubber band and how it's including, you can encompass all these different things. Was that part of your using magic realism, elastic realism? Was that part of your, did you always know that would be part of the novels?
First of all, I love that phrase, elastic realism.
Oh, good.
I'm going to adopt it and credit it to you, Nancy, because
please do.
It's perfect and concisely describes what I try and do, which is not search for magical opportunities necessarily, unless, of course, they present themselves, but to consider these realities as extensions of character and extensions of their subjectivity and their preoccupations, both personal and political. So for me, that can mean seeing ghosts, and talking to the dead. It could mean apparitions. It could mean being consumed by a scene, a distorted scene from the past, or imagining talking to El Comandante, for example, which Celia does. She always imagines him kind of looking over her shoulder and into her life. So
Right.
all of this, for me, are forms of elastic realism. Boy, it rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, it's great. I must have read it somewhere years ago, but I've always.
So I didn't set out to do that, although I'm a big fan of elastic realisms from many different cultures. Probably the first I came across most dramatically was Kafka's The Metamorphosis when I was a teenager, and I'm like, you can do this. This is and the same for reading a lot of the Russian masters, the things that happen in Gogol and or even American literature, and Toni Morrison's work, and Louise Erdrich's work in poetry of all sorts. So it's not exclusive to the Latin American imagination.
Right. And I think by thinking of it as elastic realism rather than magic, I mean, to say magical realism is to sort of place it in the Latin world, because we think of Garcia Marquez and all of that, but it is, as you say, everywhere. It's a choice that the writer makes to look beyond the world of here and now.
Yes, sort of to be open to the moment in the writing of things expanding, of unspooling in unpredictable ways.
Right. Yeah. And when at the end, so Celia is one of the great characters, I think, in contemporary literature. I mean, she's a remarkable, remarkable woman. I was just full of admiration for her, and her belief in the cause of the revolution and Castro and all of that. And you never name Castro. That's so interesting, right? He's never mentioned by name.
No, he isn't. He's always a leader, or maybe even El Comandante.
Right.
But I think for me, I was playing also along with, I mean, it's clearly Cuba by all the indications and details of this story. But I also wanted to tap into this long tradition of what I call the caudillo novels. Caudillo is like strongman in Spanish. The caudillo novels of Latin America, of which there are many. It's a very rich tradition. And so I wanted part of this story to reference that, that strongman, whether it's in Cuba or whether it was in Guatemala with El Presidente, or with Trujillo in the Dominican Republic with Vargas Llosa's the Feast of the Goat. They are a part of all of our lives, inheritances, political legacies, which people are contending with to this day.
Yeah. So then at the end of Dreaming in Cuban, it's not clear at that time, I think, to readers, when today even when somebody reads it for the first time, it isn't clear that there is going to be a sequel. In some books, it just ends, and there's got to be a sequel. And by golly, it took you 30 years or so to think of the sequel. What was the impetus for that?
Well, it's interesting. Just for your readers, the novel ends with Celia, the matriarch, the support of the revolution, walking kind of heartbroken and distraught into the sea. And the presumption is, I think, that she is going to drown herself.
Right.
And I leave it ambiguous. And so I was peppered with questions in the many years since. Well, what happened to her? Did she really die? Did she kill herself? Did the Coast Guard pick her up? What happened? And honestly, I said, I don't know. I really didn't know. But if someone had pressed me, I probably would have said, yeah, I think she took her own life. So imagine my surprise. Celia's alive. And this only happened because I revisit, for me, Dreaming in Cuban was a done deal. It was a discrete novel. I had no plans for a sequel, but many years later, I was asked to adapt the book for theater. And And so I reread the book several times to, again, refamiliarize myself with everyone. And that's when it began. That's when I started to think, well, what did happen to them? Did Celia really kill herself? What happened to Ivanito, who was kidnapped by the Lourdes, the bakery owner in Brooklyn, and hauled over, talk about culture shock, from outside of Havana to Brooklyn in the 70s, and everyone else. And it was even made, I think I had enough distance on it too, because even to adapt it, I had to change a lot of things. I had to be very flexible about the narrative, about the characters, about the time frame. And then I had actors embodying these characters in ways that I couldn't have imagined, to the extent that some of them would say, my character would say that to me. And I was like, oh. And so then everything seemed possible. Everything was back on the table. And I had been working on something else at the time. And I remember discussing with my daughter, also named Pilar. And she said, Mom, just go with what is interesting you now. And so I began Vanishing Maps like that, just as an experiment, just to find out for myself what had happened. And then it juggernauted, if that's a word, into what became Vanishing Maps.
How did you choose the title?
Vanishing Maps?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it seemed to me that I set the sequel 20 years after the original, although I was writing it nearly 30 years after the original, more like 27 years after the original. And it seemed to me that world that they were living in when the book ended in 1980 was vastly different than the one they were facing on the eve of the millennial.
Right.
Everything had happened globally: the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was absolutely crucial to revolutionary Cuba's survival.
Right.
All these seismic, cataclysmic changes that it seemed to me would have dispersed this clan around the globe, which in fact it did.
Yeah.
And so I had to consider all of that political upheaval in the big sense, with the personal dislocation of all of these characters, which of course, they ended up around the world, Moscow and Los Angeles and Berlin, and then cordon them in slowly over the course of the novel around this one character in Berlin.
Mm-hmm. I felt that, just going back to Dreaming in Cuban and Celia for a moment, one of the scenes that last scene is when she takes off the earrings that her lover of 4 days, that she's a Spanish man that she has been corresponding in her mind with for all these years, and he has given her those earrings, and she takes them off and gives them to the sea, basically, was extremely moving. But what I felt when I was reading Vanishing Maps, I thought, God, you must have done so much research for so much of this book, because it didn't seem possible that you had all this knowledge that you could just draw on out of your mind. Is that fair to say? Did you do any research?
Absolutely, a lot of historical research. Yeah. Although I have to say that for Celia herself, I hope I'm not giving away too much to say that this old lover with whom she was obsessed, in fact, I think Celia would say she had two great loves in her life: this Spaniard, Gustavo Sierra de Armas, with whom she had a very passionate 4-day affair, as you said, in the 1930s, and then Fidel Castro, a leader himself, to whom she devoted a good part of her adult life as well. Not her husband, significantly, right. Not among the great loves. But anyway, so this is another part, kind of another strain of the book, is that Gustavo contacts her. They're both in their 90s at this point. And he makes an overture to her after his wife dies.
Yeah.
And at first she's super irritable, like, who does he think he is? And, he thinks of just blah. But she ends up going to Spain for a reunion, an unexpected reunion. And that part I didn't have to research. I felt like I knew Celia well enough.
Yeah, definitely.
Even uh, even well into her, as a nonagenarian. Maybe I was clearing the path for myself as I'm now in the Medicare years. hopefully.
Yeah, really. From your
But
lips to God's ears.
exactly. And so there was that. So that was very intimate. But other parts of the book, like understanding the fallout from the Soviet Union, what happened in Berlin, what was Berlin in the 90s like when Ivanito landed there, kind of ejected from Moscow for various reasons. So yes, and in fact, I did have some research already done, as it were, because the book previous to this one is called Here in Berlin, and for that I had spent several months in Berlin, walking around, doing research, reading a lot, haunting cafes and libraries alike, and so I was able to draw on some of that, much of that wasn't used in that book. As the underpinning for this book, as the place, Berlin, as the place where everyone ultimately gathers, and Berlin as a symbol of a place that was leveled. They called it Jahr Null in German, year zero, and reinvented itself from the ground up. And which I felt in a way was what these characters were doing in the wake of all this dislocation. They were actually continually reinventing themselves, figuring out to whom and where they belonged, what their allegiances were now, and how they shifted, that it was no longer fixed. Their identities weren't fixed, but as malleable as the times that they lived in. In other words, the maps, the borders that they grew up with no longer applied.
Right. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting was the way you described through Celia's experiences in Cuba what the breakup of the Soviet Union meant to the people living in Cuba, which I don't think we often think about,
Yes.
and how
Just how closely they were intertwined. And just how much Cuba depended on the Soviet Union for literally daily remittances. It was easily over $1 million a day. I think, I don't even know what the latest figures on that were, but yes, what ensued in Cuba was a panic. Like the plug was pulled on their revolution, and suddenly lights, gas, agriculture, everything was in jeopardy. On average, people lost 30 pounds in the first year of what they called the special period, and those were very dire times. And I went to Cuba several times in those years because I had family there, and they were desperate. And so people don't even realize, the unintended consequences of political events, of war, of things you can't imagine, and how they trickle down to your life.
I thought the other headline news that you bring into Vanishing Maps is Elian Gonzalez, his experiences, and people will remember that he was the little boy who came. His mother died on the journey over the 90 miles between Cuba and the U.S., and the big fight over whether he should stay in the United States with his drunken uncles or whether he should go back to Cuba to live with his father. And the anti-communist feelings still so prevalent in Miami, in Florida, but Miami is where it's set. Is just brought back. It hasn't disappeared. I mean, it's still going on today.
It is, Nancy, astonishingly. Although I would say it's most virulent among the older generations, say, my parents' generation, they're in their late 80s. And although if you grew up in Miami, as many of my cousins did, it is something of a political hothouse. So you grow up in those, the beliefs and of your elders become part of your sensibility without you even realizing it, because there's nothing to challenge it. Like when
Right.
I grew up in New York. So yes, at home it was 1950s Cuba, but I walked out the door and I was in Brooklyn and Manhattan, and everything that all of my experiences were offering counter narratives
Right.
to the beliefs at home. But I think that's changing with the younger generations, and also with the subsequent waves of migration from Cuba. We're talking about a cohort, sadly, that is dying off now. What the future will bring overall to the Cuban American community and its diaspora, we can only hope to chronicle, but not predict.
So the cousins who all end up in Berlin one way or another, have made their way to Berlin one way or another, include Ivanito, who was the little boy who was kidnapped, really, by his aunt out of Cuba and taken to Brooklyn. And he becomes a translator, a brilliant translator, brilliant at languages. But what he really loves, the person who I believe thinks he is a drag queen, La Ivanita. And one of the cousins, Pilar, comes to Berlin with her son, and the relationship between the uncle and Azul. Am I pronouncing that at least?
A little
Yes,
bit.
it's lovely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That relationship I thought was so lovely. Gosh, you're good at those relationship things. I mean, I think you did it great. And the twins, there's twins that run in the family, and this set of twins, women, didn't meet by chance in Berlin. So you kind of get the feeling that Berlin in the 90s was the place where everything was happening and the place to be. They meet across a crowd at a club and see one another, and it's like looking in the mirror. I loved that story.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Yes, I think you're right about Berlin in the 90s was the place where everything could happen. I think in a way it paralleled Weimar Berlin in the 20s, which
Right.
drew artists from around the world, and there were no rules. The rule was that there was no rules, that there were no rules. And so it was a big free for all then after the fall of the wall. And
Mhm.
so these kinds of accidents and coincidences were common. I mean, unexpected, but common. And so it ultimately felt like the perfect backdrop for this collision and ultimately collusion of all of these disparate cousins.
Right. In your mind, do you know why the twins were separated? Why they had not been? I mean, in your mind, because it's one of those things that you leave open-ended.
Right. Untended.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was surprised by that other twin popping up too, and I thought I would. I wanted to resolve it before the end of the book, and I couldn't. I really couldn't figure it out. And one of the twins' mothers is kind of languishing in a nursing home and kind of against revealing any secrets, and the other mother was dead, and so I'm not sure they find out, or at least I don't know yet. Who knows? I may have to write another book.
Yeah, right.
Find out what happens to them.
Well, what I loved was the uncertainty. I loved the uncertainty of the ending in Dreaming in Cuban, and I loved the uncertainty of the twins' fates. And did you get pushback from your editor about needing to tie it up more neatly? Do you know what I mean?
Yes. No, I didn't. I mean, I felt more pressure on myself to at least figure it out. But like Celia, which is how we started off the conversation, I didn't really know. I mean, I could have gone one way or the other.
Right.
And with these twins whose origin story is still unknown to me, I have theories about what happened. but I'm not sure. I'm not sure yet.
Yeah. Do you think you'll continue writing about that family one way or another, or?
I'm not really sure. I'm very interested in Azul,
Yes.
who at 6 is has so much resonance with Uncle and his drag queen, brilliant translator Uncle.
And and Ivanito's mother, who appears.
Right, his crazy grandmother. I mean,
Yeah.
he's only 6, and he's
Right.
already absorbing so much, including a vivid imagination, including, I mean, he starts seeing ghosts and either having dreams or traveling with this ghost to the Arctic. All kinds of things happen.
Right.
So I think if there's anyone who is rife for a follow-up, it
Yeah.
may be him.
Yes.
But again, I'm not sure. I never know what's gonna. I mean, that's really story of my life here.
Well, I know that I and the rest of your many, many, many fans are thrilled to see Celia and the family come back, and thrilled to read Vanishing Maps, and just look forward to many more Cristina Garcia novels.
Oh, well, you're very kind. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being on the show.